most of you, I think, are probably familiar with Teams, but if you hover towards the bottom of your screen, a taskbar should come up, and you'll see that you can turn your camera on or off. If you that you can turn your mic on and off. So if you have a question, you can press the little hand icon, and that will show that you have a question, and at some point we can let Jack know that there is someone with their hand raised. You can also, beside the hand is a little chat box. If you press on that, you can see in the sidebar there will be a chat, and you can also ask your questions there. So welcome, Jack, and we're looking forward to this session.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me here. And this is, like you said, I remember March too. And it's been a long time since I've actually stood in front of an audience. I'm getting more used to just sitting in front of a computer screen, which is kind of new and exciting. But I'm excited to be able to come here today and share a session with all of you. So I'm going to switch now to share my screen. So you're not going to be able to see me, which, you know, depending on, on a lot of personal opinion, that might be a better thing. But you're going to be able to see my slides. So just if I can get, Becky, we can see that? We're good?
Yes, yes.
All right. So I've come here sort of today for the next, 45 to 60 minutes to kind of do a talk about mental distress and supporting our staff, specifically supporting staff with the idea of potentially returning back to an office setting. And maybe I can start like I was so kindly introduced. My name is Jack Vietch, and I am the Manager of Community Engagement and Education with the Canadian Mental Health Association, Haliburton Kawartha Pine Ridge branch. So basically what that means, it's my job to go out. I talk to schools and companies and private industry, and I get to teach people about mental health and mental illness. More or less, I get to teach people how to stay well. In this role, I teach a variety of certificate courses. I teach things like Safe Talk, suicide alertness for everyone. I teach ASSIST, applied suicide intervention skills training. I teach mental health first aid and mental health works, living life to the full. I'm a certified psych health and safety in the workplace advisor, and through the Talk Today program, I get to work as the mental health coach for our local OHL team over in Peterborough, the Peterborough Petes. I can tell you all that prior to doing all of that, I spent the majority of my career working in forensic case management. So some of you may know, we have a maximum security provincial detention center over here in Lindsay. And it used to be my job to go to the institution, and I would meet with inmates who were either diagnosed with a mental illness or had a suspected mental illness, and I'd assist them when they got released from jail. So helping them find a place to live, or a family doctor, a job, or a psychiatrist, whatever they identified as needs or goals. So after several years of doing that, I decided to get myself, a nice, easy desk job where now I just sit in front of a computer and talk for like an hour a day, which is kind of what I'm doing here today. So now that you know who I am, really, why am I here this morning? Well, first of all, I'm hoping we can learn to understand different communication styles and how to support various team members, really highlighting that there is no one single approach to supporting our staff. The more flexible we can be in our approaches, the more successful we're going to be in our approaches. To practice effective, clear communication skills in order to better connect, to answer questions surrounding balancing performance management and supporting staff mental health. And this is one that's kind of come up quite a bit recently with the idea of I want to support my staff's mental health. I recognize there's an international pandemic happening, that this is impacting people's health and wellness, but I still have a program to run. I still have goals and targets to hit. How do I find that balance? And hopefully we can address that today. And lastly, I want to talk about some different free resources that you can implement organizationally and even just in your programs to support the organization's mental health, to support staff mental health. So maybe we'll start off by talking about sort of the stress surrounding COVID-19. And in May of this year, CMHA Ontario Provincial Division ran out some polling data. And from that, they gathered a lot of information surrounding how the pandemic was initially impacting a lot of Ontarians and Canadians' mental health. And what they found was that Canadians were feeling more isolated than ever. It was up 8 points from 39 to 47% in that month of May 2020. More than 2/3 of Ontarians were longing for more meaningful social interactions in their daily life. And almost half were feeling anxious, only 8% feeling happy. Some pretty strong numbers when we talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had. And actually, I can tell you that there'll be some new data coming out in the next week or two, some updated polling data to see where Canadians are currently. What I can tell you as sort of a sneak peek, we have seen the rates of generalized anxiety and depression skyrocketing, not just amongst Ontarians, but across all of Canada. And I'll tell you, it doesn't matter what business I've been working with, they have come back with the same sentiment. Staff are experiencing generalized anxiety, even just the thought of returning to in-office work or returning to a more regular work schedule. How do I support that? Again, hopefully we can address that here this morning. So I can tell you, everybody, regardless of their background, age, or gender, they require a supportive communication style. This involves using nonverbal and verbal communication skills to convey things like empathy and respect, positive regard, confidence in that person's abilities. Our knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes, the experience we've had leading up to that day will impact that interaction, and that one-off interaction will impact that long-term working relationship. You know, if we were to break down communication, we can actually see that 55% of how we communicate is done via body language, 38% through our tone of voice, and just 7% of how we communicate is done with the actual words we use, less than 10%. You know, people are surprised by that, but think to yourself, who on this call right now has ever gotten a text or an email from somebody and you just have the words in front of you? And you read that text or that email and you think to yourself, okay, are they trying to be funny or are they a jerk? Because I'm missing so much when I don't have that body language. Even right now, because you can't see my face, I'm losing more than half of the communication skills that I have to convey what I'm trying to teach, what I'm trying to share, which means, and we'll talk about this, well, what if I'm in a situation where I'm meeting with the staff over the phone or via teleconference where I can't see them? All of a sudden, the weight of my tone, the weight of my words grows exponentially because I'm losing big pieces of my communication. So if we actually were to break this down a bit further, you know, so the following nonverbal behaviors, they generally tend to promote that increased trust and they open up communication. So displaying an open posture, especially with your arms, keeping an appropriate distance, making frequent but soft eye contact, appearing calm and relaxed. You know, all those things being said, displaying that open posture, you know, we have our closed off arms in front of our chest. What could that mean to some? Well, perhaps being closed off or confrontational, crowding or cornering a person, staring through them or making that intense eye contact. Again, just being cognizant of how we present using body language. And all that said, it's always so important that we think about culture when we talk about body language. We don't take what we call an ethnocentric approach to communication, or the idea that the way things are done in my culture, the way I see things, are the only way things are done. And, you know, I can tell you, I was very guilty of this. And I think specifically of that first bullet there, open posture with your arms. And I'll tell you all, I taught for years. For years, I taught about arms folded in front of your chest. And again, what does that mean to many? It means that perhaps I'm closed off, I'm confrontational, I'm disinterested. And I always would sort of suggest the idea of being open and more welcoming in our body language. The example I would always use, if I was meeting an inmate for the first time and they were incarcerated and they came around the corner to see and meet with me and they saw me sitting in my chair with my arms folded across my chest, is that going to be a good first interaction? Probably not. And I'll tell you, I taught that for years. And I was teaching a course downtown. And I finished teaching this one particular session. And when I finished, was approached by a woman who said to me, Jack, you know, actually, in my culture, where I'm from, standing with your arms folded in front of your chest is a sign of respect. You're putting your hands away. You're not fiddling with anything. You're focusing on this person and what they have to say. And I thought, man, I just totally missed the mark on this. And it makes me think even things like eye contact. What we saw a lot of times in our criminal justice system was that persons of First Nations descent, if they were brought in front of a Canadian criminal justice system, a lot of times when the judge was speaking, they would not make eye contact with the judge, which was interpreted as being, well, very disrespectful. Maybe how I was raised or what I was taught, when someone of authority speaks to me, I'm supposed to stand up straight and look them in the eye. What we missed was that for this person, in their culture, looking someone of authority in the eyes while they were speaking was seen as very disrespectful. And by looking away, they were showing respect in their culture. Again, really mindful. I don't always assign value to body language without thinking about the other individual's culture. Again, I can be cognizant of how I present and how I interact, but I just don't automatically assign value to another. So body language is a big one. Tone of voice is huge. The tone of voice, the way we speak, communicates respect or disrespect, understanding or impatience. Man, tone of voice says a ton. Yeah, no, I went to that talk with Jack this morning. It was the best talk I ever heard in my entire life. I mean, the words are all there, But what is that tone really saying? Again, that tone, and I hope no one says it like that, but that tone is really saying, man, it was boring, it's disingenuous, it's sarcastic. Like I said, I hope you write that down. But when you say it in that manner, it means something very different. The pace, the volume, is there tone in my voice? Is there emotion in my voice? And at this point, I always like to pause and I like to talk about classroom versus that day. Because, I realize classroom, the setting we're in right now, this stuff, it's very easy. Jack, man, I don't yell at my staff. I'm patient. I'm mindful of my tone and my volume. But what about on that day? People know what I mean when I say that day? That day when you woke up and your alarm didn't go off, so you're an hour late for work. And when you finally get the kids to the bed, they refuse to put shoes on. They won't even tell you why. They just refuse to put shoes on. And you finally get them out the door and you finally drop them off at school. But now you're 2 hours late for work. Because you're 2 hours late for work, you missed a staff meeting. And because you missed a staff meeting, somebody signed you up for something. Because as soon as you miss a staff meeting, someone signs you up for something. So you finally get to your desk with these new tasks that need to be done before lunch. And you realize you forgot your lunch. You left your lunch at home with the dog that you didn't let out, who's going to tear up your couch. And that staff, whose question you've answered 10 times already, comes to your door. They knock on your door. They ask you the exact same question for an 11th time. Is there the possibility? Is there the potential? There might just be a little bit of tone in your response, a little bit of emotion in your voice. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that's not human. What I'm saying is we need to be mindful of it. I need to be mindful that today has sucked. And I can't let that translate into the communication I'm going to have with that staff. Because like we said earlier, that one-off interaction will absolutely impact that long-term working relationship. So I can answer that question the same calm, clear, and direct way I did the first 10 times. And when I leave my office, I can lay my head down on my desk. But being mindful, again, of how we communicate specifically during that day. So again, active listening is essential to any relationship, and how do we show active listening? Well, we're paying attention. We're not showing judgment. We're showing that we're listening, paraphrasing or mirroring or giving that feedback, asking open-ended questions. Again, tell me more about that. And on this next slide, I've got some listening skills. I know everyone in here knows how to listen, but here's things that can make us even better. So again, try to ask fewer questions and instead making statements like, well, it's really helpful to know, or I'd like to know more about that. Tuning in, being really present. I look at this list, and it's the list that I made, and every time I look at it, I think to myself, man, I was not a real good social worker. I was not really good at a lot of these things. And I can specifically remember when I think about tuning in, I can vividly recall, maybe it's like a Friday. It's a Friday, I'm in my office, I've got a client sitting across from me, and it's like 4 o'clock, the last appointment of the day, and they're talking, and I'm listening. They're talking, I got my pen and my paper, and I'm taking my notes, and I'm listening. But slowly, as that person's talking, my mind, it starts to drift towards, man, I'm hungry. Like, I'm really hungry. I'm gonna get a pizza tonight. I'm gonna get a Domino's pizza tonight. And the Blue Jays play tonight. Can watch the Jays on the deck and have a drink. It's gonna be sunny tomorrow. Take the boat in the lake and go swimming. Man, I work too hard. I deserve nice things. And then I realize I've been daydreaming for about 4 or 5 minutes. And that person, they're still talking. And I have no idea what they just said for the last 5 minutes. Again, I didn't really tune in. I wasn't really present. I let everything else in my life sort of take over. I lost focus on that person in that moment. And again, I can absolutely respect. If you let every staff talk at you for as long as they wanted, whenever they wanted, there'd be no time for anything else. But for the time that you can allocate, if it's 30 minutes, if it's 30 seconds, being tuned in and present in that moment, not worrying about earlier or later, focusing on that person and that interaction. Again, remaining calm, validating that person's experience or feeling, which again is very real to them. And we'll talk about that with that idea of returning to work and the idea that I might have been working from an office a couple days a week already. I may already be here and I don't feel a whole lot of anxiety, or maybe I never felt a whole lot of anxiety returning to work. And the idea that my staff it just doesn't, how could you feel that way? We've got all this protective measures, we've got all this equipment, we've done all this thing to make sure you're safe. Again, whether or not I think it's real to them. And I always try to emphasize that. Validate that person's feeling, which again is real to them. Not making assumptions, trying to take control, not expressing frustration, even though you might be feeling it, especially on that day. And I'll tell you all, one of the best listening skills I can share with all of you is allowing for silence. And I'll tell you truthfully, it is something to this day I personally am terrible at. I find a lot of times if I ask a person a question or make a statement and they don't respond to me in a period of time that I think is appropriate, that everything in my brain just screams, say something else. Clarify what you said. Ask a different question because I'm super uncomfortable with this awkward silence right now. Again, when I do that, I'm doing two things. One, I'm taking away time for processing from that individual. And two, I'm taking ownership of that silence. I'll tell you what that means. Tell you an absolutely true story. So my very first gig at CMHA was many years ago at a place called Harrison House. Some of you may know it's a transitional home here in Lindsay for people living with serious persistent mental illness to learn independent living skill and eventually move out to the community and live on their own. So at this point in time in my career, I was as green as grass and pretty low in the hierarchy. And I drew the short straw. I had to go and collect rent. So I was literally going room to room, door to door, knocking on doors, asking for rent money. So I'm making my way through this house and I knock on this one gentleman's door and he comes to the door and asks me for the rent. He looks at me and says, "Don't have it, don't got it." I remember I said to him, "Well, you can't really do that if you don't pay the rent. You can't stay here. It's not how that program works." So we brought this guy down to the meeting room and sat at a table much like the one I'm at right now. My colleague sat on one side, my supervisor on another, and this gentleman sat across the table from me. And I remember I said to that individual, I said, "Okay, so what are we going to do to get this rent paid?" And he sat and he stared at me in silence for what seemed like 2 years. It was probably about 30 seconds of him just sitting and staring at me and not saying a word. But I'll tell you what, if I sat here in silence right now and didn't say a thing, more than one of you might just start to wonder, did I get disconnected from this call? Is he still teaching? Did he fall asleep? Again, and everything in my mind at that point is just screaming, say something else. Clarify what you said. Boss, why are you not jumping in here? I thought you were a social work expert. Can't you feel how weird this is? But what my colleagues were doing was actually very intentional. Again, when I jump in that situation, one, I'm taking away time for processing. Just because I've determined he hasn't enough time to think of an answer to my question, when I jump in, I reasonably take away time for him to think of a response. And secondly, and more importantly, this actual scenario, when I jump in that situation, I take ownership of that silence. It's no longer his responsibility to answer my question, is it? Because I was uncomfortable, I gave answers, I gave solutions, I took ownership of that silence, I took ownership of that problem. Again, what I really want to suggest is the idea of getting comfortable sitting in that discomfort. Allow that person to own that silent air and effectively own that problem. And I'll tell you what, the idea of allowing a staff or someone in our lives to own that silence, to own that issue, is a skill that takes practice. And I'll tell you this, if anyone of us here has or has had this individual in their lives, they are the elite of allowing silence, and that is teenagers. And I hopefully got some nodding heads or smiles on the other side of this. You ask a teenager a question they don't want to answer, what are they going to do? They're going to stare back at you in silence. I asked that teenager, "Hey, can you take the garbage out for me?" And they sit in silence. And when they sit in silence, what never happens? We never address the root cause, because I jump in and ask more questions and change, and the whole conversation gets derailed from, "Can you take the garbage out?" to, "You better find somewhere else to live," because this whole thing just escalated and got redirected. And again, what never happens was the original requested task. Again, if I ask a question of my staff that they're not comfortable, they want to sit in silence, I will sit here with you. I'll allow you to own that silence, to process that information, and to respond to me in an appropriate fashion. All right. And let's sort of our last little skill here, and we'll transition to some other stuff when we talk about accommodation in the workplace and return to work planning. I want to talk about muscle versus massage statements. You know, when we use muscle statements, well, we take control, we define options, we don't ask, we make decisions about what to do, we make assumptions and we're coercive, we increase tension, we use power to get what we want. When we use massage statements, we're validating and supporting, we're asking what they're making assumptions, we're giving real choices, and we're sharing power where appropriate. You know, I'll teach this slide and I'll have people say to me, "Jack, man, when I use muscle statements, I get what I want and I get it way faster." Maybe in the short term. But I ask all those people the same thing. If I have to re-enter communication 2 weeks later with a person I just muscled all over the first time, Is it going to be easier or harder to work with that person in the next situation? I'll tell you, it's going to be that much harder, because that wall that I kicked down, they spent those last 2 weeks rebuilding it even stronger, even taller, and they are begging me to try to kick it down again. When I use massage statements, again, I'm validating and supporting. I'm giving choices and sharing power where appropriate. Again, I can absolutely respect that in your roles, there are definitely things that just have to happen. Jack, at the end of the day, I don't even necessarily care about it, but it's a policy, it's a process, it's a law. It's just something that has to happen. There's no real leeway here. Well, maybe if there's a destination we have to get to, can we work together to choose the route? People thrive on choice. And again, saying to this individual, here's where we got to get to. Here's what has to happen. Here's the 3 possible routes we can take to get there. Which one would work best for you? Sharing that little bit of power won't just be easier for the individual. It'll be significantly easier for you. I'll say this now, I'll say it throughout. It is significantly easier working with somebody than it is working at somebody. Involving a person in that process makes it that much more likely they're going to want to do the things in the plan. Building with instead of at as a system. So when we're talking about mental health in a leadership perspective, so supporting my staff's mental health, there's a couple of key little bullets I want to talk about. And that first one in big bold letters there, it's always so important that we never assign a diagnosis to our staff. If there's any HR staff in this call right now, they just fainted at the very notion. But the idea, again, I'm not going to my staff and saying, I think you're experiencing bipolar disorder. I think you're experiencing anxiety. Again, we're not going to base our conversation off a diagnosis or telling them what we believe they're diagnosed with. We're going to start a conversation based on observation. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We want to utilize any in-house supports that we have. If we have an HR team, if we have team leads or counseling staff in-house, I'm sure that I know at Five Guys there are tons of skilled professionals that might be able to be used as a resource to help support individuals in the organization. Respecting confidentiality is always going to be integral to any staff support. Providing training opportunities for staff, ones like this and other future options, which I'll talk about later in the slides. And just of note, mental distress does not always present itself the same way in everybody. And when I teach a lot of different courses about mental distress and supporting a person that's maybe struggling, there's that sort of notion that, well, the person I'm supporting is going to be the sad, the tearful, the withdrawn. Mental distress isn't always, again, that sad or withdrawn. And I steal this from another course that I teach. Sometimes people invite help in the most uninviting ways. Sometimes it's frustration, it's anger, it's picking a fight in staff meetings, it's blatantly refusing tasks, it's anger or frustration or aggression. Those outward signs might be an indication to us that that staff maybe isn't doing well. Don't always imagine that distress will present itself the same way in every staff. So if I do have a staff that I believe may be struggling, well, how can I approach them? How might I be able to address it? Well, I've got sort of a 3-step system here. When we're talking about conversations with employees, again, like I said earlier, we want to start our conversation based on observation, being clear in what I'm noticing. Hey, Jack, I'm noticing you're having a hard time making it here for 8:30 for start, or I'm noticing during team meetings you're not engaged the same way you normally are, or during your lunch breaks you're not eating with your friends or your colleagues like you normally have, or you're not engaging the same way in tasks like you have in the past. Sharing those observations with that person, sharing those observations actually lets the employee know a couple things. One, somebody noticed. Somebody cared enough to notice that maybe I'm not engaged the same way I normally have been. Somebody noticed I'm not putting the same level into my meeting with my peers or my colleagues or my work or performance. Secondly, somebody cared. Somebody cared enough to actually talk to me and address this with me. Sharing those observations can help. And I'll tell you what can be especially helpful and what I would strongly suggest is having observations documented, putting it down, dates, times, having that documentation backup. I used to do training with teachers and high school teachers about PD days or parent-teacher nights, I should say. And the idea that it's so much easier to come to a parent with documented evidence than it can be with sort of like that anecdotal support. You sit down with a parent and you tell that parent, I think your child's struggling. The first question that parent will always ask is, why? Why do you think that? Well, it's just what I've noticed. As opposed to, Well, here on Wednesday morning, they didn't want to come in from recess. Thursday at lunch, found them crying in the coat room. Friday during gym class, they're refusing to participate. Having those dates and times documented can help build that evidence. Much the same with that staff, sharing that little bit of evidence and having it documented. And again, having that documentation, if we have to move through a more intensive or corrective action process, again, will prove significantly beneficial. And again, just really highlighted just again, we're not providing a diagnosis, we're sharing observation. And once we have shared that observation with that staff, it's just as simple as asking for clarification. Tell me why. Tell me why I might be seeing or noticing these things. How are you doing? What's going on with you that this is sort of arisen in your work? Asking that person to clarify where they're at. And again, this isn't about, hey, I'm about to be your therapist or your counselor and fix everything for you. I'm just simply asking for clarification just to tell me why. Tell me where you're at. And lastly, how can we collaborate? How can we work together to get these tasks done? And again, this is not what I as a supervisor am going to do to fix everything for you. It's not what you as a staff are going to do on your own to just correct all this stuff. But how can we work effectively together to meet the core expectations of the role? And we'll talk about this as well, having a very clearly laid out job description with our core expectations of the role can be very helpful again in this process. Here are our core expectations of the role. How can I support you in meeting these expectations? So when we're talking again, and we'll talk a bit about accommodation, I should just know, we're going to talk about, well, how do I actually, staff needs a special accommodation? We'll talk about that in a couple slides. So returning to work during COVID-19, you know, it doesn't matter what company, what industry I've worked with frankly, from April to today. Whenever there's the conversation about returning to work, it's the same sentiment. My staff are experiencing anxiety at the very idea of returning to an in-office setting. How can I support my staff and bring them back to office? Some of the things that I can suggest that I've seen in different industries that have been successful, allowing for that open dialogue with staff to share their thoughts, ideas, concerns. So again, connecting, if I have a smaller staff team, can I arrange a time to connect one-to-one? If I have a larger organizational sort of goal, can I send out a survey or some sort of instrument to collect from that staff their thoughts or concerns about work, hearing where they're at? Maybe my staff team for my particular team is totally fine with the idea of returning to work. They have no concerns. They're just ready to go. They don't want to be in their house any longer. They're ready to get back to an office. Maybe it's the exact opposite. They have some real trepidation about the idea of working alongside colleagues they haven't seen in some time. Gathering that data, allowing for that feedback. Where I've seen very successful is in those small teams. And again, I recognize some teams are very large and it's not a reality, but if I could, looking to arrange personal meetings with any staff that had those strong concerns. So staff that are really upset, meeting with those staff, either on phone or by Skype, again, offering to them what would be the best way for us to meet. Let's do that, and I can start to hear your concerns, and we can start to work through and support you in this return to office setting. And again, we're validating how they're feeling and sharing what we're doing. So in that meeting, I'm hearing about your concerns. Here's what we've done. Here's what we're planning to do. And with your feedback, I think that's great. We'll take that up the chain and decide if it's something we can implement. One of the best sort of questions I'd heard, and I'll steal this from another consultant, and one of the names I'll throw at you guys is Mary Ann Baton, who's sort of a guru in the field of mental health accommodation. She talked about the idea that staff, again, really anxious about returning to work. And one question she thought that you could ask, and I thought it was an awesome one. What is it about working from home that helps you to feel safe? How can we replicate that here? So is it that when I work at home, I have my own private space that no one's coming in and out of? Amazing. Can we replicate that in the office? Can we give you a private space, or can we give you an office, or can we give you an area of the office where staff know that that's your space and no one's sharing that workspace? Maybe it's, well, I know who's coming and going from my area. I know who I'm going to be seeing. Can we plan? Can we accommodate? Can we support? Again, can we replicate what you have at home potentially here to try to alleviate some of those concerns? And again, I absolutely understand we want to support those staff, but I'm sure, I know at my organization, I'm certain at your organization, there are probably some programs that just have to happen in the office setting. Can we make that happen, helping you feel as safe as possible? If we do need to move into accommodation, well, quite frankly, there's 4 simple steps to creating any accommodation, not just a mental health accommodation, but any accommodation plan. Recognizing the need, gathering the relevant information, writing the plan, implementation, and review. So again, recognizing the need, and that's as simple as gathering those observational data. So gathering those observations, and again, this is why I always strongly suggest having it documented. It's going to be a lot easier if we're moving through a long accommodation plan process to have documented evidence of this is where I was seeing that potentially that staff struggling. Gathering that relevant information, that could be directly from the staff. What can I do to support you? It might be reaching out to an external third party. So again, this is where having that very clearly laid out job description is going to be very helpful. So maybe it's about reaching out to that individual's physician and saying, okay, here is the job description, and we're going to send what we call a functional assessment or an FA off to this physician. And that physician is going to say, okay, of the core expectations in this job description, how would this person, and the term they would coin is disability, how would the disability, quote unquote, impact the individual's ability to perform this task or this role? And they're going to send back that information to the employer. They're not going to say what that quote unquote disability was, but it's going to help to reflect how it might impact core expectations of the role. And from that data, we can start to write those accommodation plans. And on the next slide, I'll show some sample accommodations again. We can start to do that collaboratively, having that person invested. And like I said earlier, having this other individual, having the staff involved in this process isn't just easier for them, it's significantly easier for you. How much more likely am I to participate in a plan if I help to design it, as opposed to having someone else design it at me and telling me this is what I'm going to do to be well, perform well, and do well at my job. And lastly, implementation and review. Writing an accommodation doesn't just mean, well, I write it and I leave it and it's forever. We have an ongoing review process, checking in routinely to make sure, is it still working? Does it need to be adapted? Can we move on from it? Do we need to implement further accommodation? What can we do to continue to improve and move forward? And I've heard this from a lot of different organizations. The idea that, Jack, if I have an accommodation plan for a staff or a staff requires accommodation, I can no longer engage in performance management. My hands are tied. It's actually the exact opposite. An accommodation plan actually can allow me for a more enhanced level of supervision. Again, you think about the alternative, which would be I'm seeing a behavior or I'm seeing a performance issue or I'm seeing a concern. I move directly to corrective action. I tell them to improve it or move on, as opposed to bringing that staff in, hearing where they're at, meeting their needs, and working towards a resolution. I'll always say this, it's 1.5 times more expensive to replace an employee than to train up or support a current. Again, there is a humanistic approach to a lot of this that I want my staff to be and live and have healthy lives. There is a business approach to this. If I can keep my staff healthy and in the role, it's significantly financially beneficial to the organization, to my program. Again, if that staff chooses not to adhere to this collaborative accommodation plan, I absolutely have the right to move into a more traditional corrective action plan. But again, suggesting that we stay away from an initially punitive measure by moving into a more collaborative approach, we're going to create a greater rate of success for both us and that staff. If we do have to move towards corrective action, the additional bonus will be I have all this documented evidence that shows all the areas in which I and the organization worked to support this staff, and here's where they chose not to adhere to that collaborative plan, as opposed to just straight punitive action from the get-go. So again, I have a list here of some potential accommodations. And again, I absolutely recognize that this is not a mandate that everyone works for everything. Again, I've done work with factories where they'll say things like, Jack, flexible scheduling is just not an option. I've got a factory line. I need a human body on this line at this time, or my factory doesn't run. Again, this isn't of what you have to do. These are potential options of what you could do. So it could be, again, flexible scheduling, changes in supervision, the information delivery, even simple things. You know, I've had staff before that are so anxious at the very idea of a supervision meeting, even just with me or another direct supervisor, that the entire meeting, they don't hear a word. They just feel their chest pounding with their heart, they're sick to their stomach, and they're going to get fired and get in trouble. They don't hear a thing. Maybe changing the way I deliver that information during that supervision. I can provide your supervision notes to you in writing, 72 hours or 24 hours before our supervision meeting. You can take the information, review it, and come to that meeting ready to have a discussion. offering those sort of alternatives, changes in time or training, time and space, modifying job duties, again, in recognition of the core expectations of the job description, even utilizing simple technology like UV lamps. The simple things we talk about, changing space, changing areas or offices. Again, we know, quite frankly, that sunlight is beneficial to mental health, period. We also know that window offices or workspace with window access is limited, period. I understand this better than as a lot do. I worked in a correctional facility for many years, and believe it or not, there weren't a lot of big bay windows in the institution, not a lot of sunlight just shining through, which meant a lot of staff had areas that did not have natural light shining through. Well, what can we do to try to replicate that? I can't move every staff in the institution to the 10 offices that have windows, but can I try to replicate that in some way? Simple UV lamps that you can get at Shoppers Drug Mart for $35 that some benefits packages will even cover can help to replicate those sun's natural rays. So I can't move you to a window. We're going to provide you with a low-cost lamp to help benefit your mental health and wellness. Again, that simple idea of modifying workspace or potentially adjusting instead of changing the location. And even simple job coaching as well. So if we're thinking more, again, organizationally, and if there's any questions about any of this too, towards the end, there'll be a section for questions or comments as well. Some different tools I want to sort of give to as an organizational structure. One is the standard, the Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace Standard that was enacted in January 2013. It was a CSA standard written in partnership with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Now, there was some initial discussion, I remember, in 2013, 2014, that, that one day this is going to be law. This is going to be mandated as law. This is a voluntary standard, and I'll tell you quite frankly, I don't foresee any future where it will be mandated as law. Sort of think of it as best practice. It's a free document that anyone can access through the Mental Health Commission or the CSA. It's about 70 pages, and it gives a structure and framework for helping to implement mentally healthy practices to create psychologically healthy and safe workspaces. Again, a simple document to follow, while voluntary, can kind of be seen as best practice. And actually, I was part of a group that did some pilots, some piloting of the standard in 2014. There were different agencies across Ontario that were selected as different pilot organizations, one of them being the HKPR District Health Unit, which I worked with different implementation strategies. And again, I won't go through all the data here because I don't think necessarily that's practical, but what we can say quite frankly, we saw improvement in engagement. We saw a reduction in absenteeism. We saw a reduction in loss. So the focus of the standard is pretty simple. Identifying psychological hazards and risks, implementation practices, working on organizational culture, that ever elusive quote unquote organizational culture, improving employee culture, measuring and sustainability, different tools you can use to implement, and increasing overall knowledge and skill sets surrounding mental health and wellness. A lot of times, what the idea was is just by bringing in education and awareness and letting staff and employees know, here's your EAP and your EFAP and community resources and programs you can access to be and stay well. We saw a positive return from those staff, from those organizations. Again, even in things like cost effectiveness, like I said, we saw reduced disability claims, reduced sick days, lower cases of presenteeism. And you know, people say, well, what do you mean presenteeism? We know absenteeism. My staff isn't well, they don't show up today. What about when my staff's really struggling and they still show up, but they're not able to engage to their full and maximum capacity? They're there, but they're not really there. Trying again to reduce instances of presenteeism. What we actually know, mental health concerns cost our Canadian economy $50 billion, and that's with a B, just to be sure, $50 billion annually. Again, in lost time, in disability claims, presenteeism. If we're able to provide support to our staff's mental wellness in a primary preventative measure, we can do things to help our staff be well before they become unwell. We can not only just reduce the amount of time that we lose, we can actually save for the organization. And again, our 4 different levels of implementation, much the same as an accommodation plan. What resources do I have? Engaging leadership and labor management. You know, so if there's a unionized environment, making sure that all levels of leadership from both union and organization are on board. What I will say about this standard, it will only be successful with a top-down approach, like any change management in an organization. If it does not have the buy-in from the most senior levels of leadership, it will not be successful. So ensuring that it has that trickle-down approach whenever we're talking about implementation, and then again, to embedding across the organization and having ongoing review and implementation. So So before I turn it over for questions, I want to give you guys, again, four simple resources that, again, are absolutely free. So in the bottom right corner there, you'll see the cover page of our Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace Standard. Again, a free CSA standard you can download today if you are so inclined. I want to give you guys two separate free tools that help with the implementation of that standard. So the first is called Guarding Minds at Work. So again, guardingmindsatwork.ca is a free tool that helps to, again, gather the data from staff via survey, analyze that data, and helps to kick out suggestions for ways to help to work towards mentally healthy workplace. And what I've found a lot of times is using tools like Guarding Minds. And again, Civic Action has a tool called Minds Matter, which does the exact same thing. So those tools are free. A lot of times what we find when we work with organizations and use these tools, it's a lot of, hey, you guys are doing great. A lot of what you've done here works really well. Keep doing it. And it reinforces that idea that we're creating mentally healthy workspaces and helps to get a voice back from staff who can start to suggest other ways to better or improve mental health in the workplace. The last program I didn't really have a whole lot of time to talk about, but I have at length in a lot of other sessions, is a program called Bounce Back. And some of you may be familiar with it. Bounce Back is a cognitive behavioral therapy correspondence program. So it's a program that has booklets right to the person's doorstep based on a model of cognitive behavioral therapy to help individuals 15 and over work through whatever self-identified goals they have. So depression, anxiety, self-esteem, jealousy, anger, whatever that person wants to work through, they can. They work through independently on their own with referral from primary healthcare provider. Bounce Back is 100% absolutely free. It's been running across Ontario since 2017. In the last few months, it was actually funded by the federal government. It now runs across Canada. Absolutely free. Free, publicly funded psychotherapy, which I know people in this room will know is not a common thing. Recognizing it, there's often a cost to psychotherapy. Utilizing this sort of form of support, again, has had fantastic results. And if people I'm happy to send you some of the different data that we've gathered. At this point, our pilot for Bounce Back had about an 80% success rate, and our rates sit around 70 to 80% currently. So we're seeing some really great data and some really high influx in the Bounce Back program, quite frankly, since April, which, again, for obvious reasons. So with all that information in a 45-minute window with 15 minutes for questions, I don't know if I should stop sharing the slides or not. It's maybe I can see my face again. I don't know, Becky, your call. Do you want me to leave this up or turn it off?
No, turn it off, Jack. And then when people ask questions, they can see you. That would be a great idea.
All right, let's see if that works. Hope to freeze. All right, so people can see the panic in my eyes when they ask me a hard question I don't know the answer to. All right.
So does anyone have any questions for Jack?
It was fairly informative, so I actually have no questions.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks, Jack.
I actually have a question. So when I was thinking about, when you were talking about mental health accommodation suggestions, I was thinking about, so for IIQ, we basically are in offices and those suggestions made sense. And I'm thinking about the educators in playrooms and needing to make accommodations. That might be a little bit trickier. Have you heard any suggestions from teachers or other educators around that kind of accommodation?
Where I've heard really similar is with working with ECEs in childcare facilities, and not even just pandemic. I'm talking pre-pandemic, where I had a staff that struggled with generalized anxiety, and we have a setting where we have to have this staff or two staff in this room. They can't leave. And again, it was a safety concern. So if that staff had a panic attack and had to leave, they can't leave. It risks their job, it risks safety. There's all kinds of measures. What I've seen kind of done is looking to have, is there some sort of backup we can have? So if that staff is triggered or is struggling, can we rotate staff through for support? And again, I recognize that financially that might not be an option, but what can we do to try to build in structural support where it's maybe a supervisor that's on call in that emergency instance, where we have some sort of backup plan to provide support, And again, I'll just be totally blunt. In the world we're entering right now, it's going to be a very anxious time. I can only imagine for a lot of those staff that are in classroom settings. So what can I do to try to create that classroom setting that makes it safe? And the best thing I would suggest is trying to gather that data from the staff themselves. And what would help? What can we do that can help you? And again, they might suggest things I can't do. Here, I can't do that, but here's what I could do, and try to brainstorm with that staff to hear from them. But again, that's one I've heard, not just during, I'm talking pre-pandemic, as a pretty common one.
Thank you. I've heard from a number of supervisors, and I don't know if any supervisors want to speak to this or not, that prior to opening, it was more about the anticipation of opening that was causing anxiety. And now that some programs are back and are getting into a new normal, that anxiety is decreasing a bit. Are supervisors continuing to see that?
I can speak to that from my perspective. I don't know if the supervisor, but I can tell you that I've seen that again across organizations. They're saying that the staff that have been here or that have come back, their anxiety is quite low, but it's initial return. So again, it's sort of like that transitionary phase of, I've transitioned my first group of staff through and they're doing well. I'm transitioning my new staff through and seeing what's worked and hearing their concerns and making adaptations. And as people, again, just like you're identifying, get into that new routine, you start to see, for many, I shouldn't say for all, but for many, the anxiety start to alleviate.
Thanks. I see that Nadia has her hand up. Nadia?
Hi. Yeah. No, I've seen the same kind of thing where my staff is a little bit calmer. However, now that we're starting off with September, I feel like I'm starting to see it kind of rise up a little bit more because of the uncertainty of the schools. So it's starting to creep back up, and not only with the staff, but also with many of us supervisors, which kind of make it hard to sell it to our workers when we may not necessarily be there as well.
You know, that's a
really good point.
That's a great, I'll tell you what, Natty, there was something I remember.
Initially, before we opened, it was there was a lot of anxiety. But once we were living into our new normal, it kind of eased in and it just became natural. And now that we're going to be expanding our programs again, you can definitely see that people are thinking and it's starting to process again, right? So it's just addressing those concerns about the reopening plan because it'll look different.
This is really good stuff. And here's what I like to think of. There's two things I'll sort of mention. The one bonus is, here, in a sense, we've seen staff struggle with experiencing anxiety before, even ourselves. What was last time? And this is what's great, is reminded that staff, we've been in this area before. We felt this way before. What worked last time? Can we do it again? So last time when you felt anxious, was it helpful to have the enhanced PPE? Was it helpful to have the enhanced meetings? Was it helpful to have the enhanced support? What was it that worked last time that we can replicate again? And just like Nadia said, there's actually been a lot of research in the area of leadership. And what a lot of employees have found, and a lot of research has found, as employees, I should say, research has found that when employees have a leader that comes to them and says, we've got it fixed, we've got it solved, don't worry about it, we know exactly what we're going to do, then the majority of cases, employees see that as disingenuous, and they do not connect or relate well with that leader. On the flip side, when leadership will come and say, you know what, we're here too, and we don't have all the answers, but we're going to work with you and we're going to collaborate to do this together, that you're going to see a better return from your staff. So I love the idea of saying, I feel that way too, potentially. I feel like a bit nervous and unsure, but we're going to work together and do what we can to keep you as safe as possible. Having that honest, transparent approach, you're going to see a better return from your employees than trying to put on that facade. So I love the idea of Natty just being honest.
Any other questions? I thought it was interesting, Jack, that you had discussed the Guarding Lines at Work resource, because at 5 counties were using that resource. And the first year that they did it, there were some indicators that were kind of red flags for management. So the strategy was to develop an employee advisory group to work with management to be kind of the liaison between staff and leadership in that role. And it was a really great process. I was on that committee, and it was really eye-opening, right?
Mhm.
So we've had our next guarding at work survey, and all of the areas that were red flagged have now improved. So this will be an interesting process. So
Well, I think that's a testament.
Source.
It's a testament to the work you put in. So I mean, kudos to you and the organization. And just like was said, it's always nice to see that quantitative data, that quantitative improvement that we actually can measure. And just like it's identified in the standard, having champions, just like you've done. So selecting a group that's going to be our champions of mental health to help enforce this messaging, to reinforce the communication. I mean, kudos. All I can say, that's a job well done.
Thanks, Jack. Any other questions or comments that anybody wanted to make before we wrap up today? Sounds like maybe we don't have any questions. Someone is saying thank you. It was very informative and this was helpful and appreciated. Do we get the PowerPoint? Someone is saying.
Yes, absolutely. I will send the PowerPoint later. Thank you all so much. I will send the PowerPoint along. And if there's ever any questions too, feel free to send me an email. I'll do the best I can to help you out. Okay.
And Jack, I think you sent me the PowerPoint. So if I have your permission, I can send it to everybody for you if you'd like. Okay. Yep. On behalf of the community, we'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge today, Jack. We really appreciate it. Sorry for the little hiccups at the beginning.
No one even noticed.
And have a great day. And I guess we'll see you, is it next month? I forget where it is on my calendar for the session with educators.
I always just say I'll see you soon. I'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, supervisors. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Do you want to connect on another line, Ellen?
Sure.
Sure.
Thanks, everybody.